Bombs are falling all over the Middle East, oil is spiking, markets are bleeding red, and before a single missile launched, the US had already attacked Iran. Not with jets, but with dollars. Gold crashed nearly 10% during the war it was designed for, Bitcoin dropped, flushed the leverage, and then snapped back within 48 hours. The fourth turning is accelerating. The old monetary order isn't collapsing on its own, it's being taken apart by the people who built it. So if gold can't hold during the crisis it was made for, and the dollar itself is the weapon, what's actually left on the board? Welcome to No Second Best, the show where conviction meets reality, and reality points straight to Bitcoin. I'm your host Hurley. Now let's get into it. The United States and Israel have launched Operation Epic Fury, which includes precision strikes against Iran's nuclear sites, command centers, and oil infrastructure. We're now on day 4 of the conflict, following Iran's supreme leader being killed in a strike over the weekend. Energy infrastructure is burning, and the Strait of Hormuz is effectively shut down. And gold, the asset that ran to $5,400 on exactly this kind of fear, just got smashed. It's now down below pre-war levels. Over $1 trillion wiped out of precious metals in 80 minutes. Bitcoin dropped from around 65,000 to 63,000 on Friday night when the strikes first hit. But by Sunday morning, it was back right where it started. And on Monday, it briefly hit 70K before settling back around 68K today. ETFs recorded $1.5 billion in inflows over the last 5 days, with nearly all 10 spot ETFs seeing action. So gold continues to look a little toppy even during an all-out hot war. Bitcoin is absorbing the shock and bouncing, and the dollar is being used as the weapon itself. So that's the setup. But before we can understand what Bitcoin's doing, we need to understand what gold has been telling us. The most important thing about gold at $5,000 isn't the price. It's that the dollar index is still in the high 90s. That wasn't supposed to happen. Everyone who called gold to 5,000 expected the DXY to break down alongside it. Brent Johnson explains what that disconnect actually means on a recent episode of What Bitcoin Did.
And I think the thing I would point out, I think a lot of people probably thought gold was going to go to $5,000, but I don't know anybody that thought gold would go to $5,000 and the dollar index would still be in the high 90s. Synonymous with the gold 5,000 call was typically calls for DXY to be in the 80s, 70s, or even 60s. And I think the fact that the DXY has remained strong on a relative basis over the last several years, even though gold has been rising, shows that it's not necessarily just a rejection of the dollar, it's a rejection of fiat overall. And it's an indication that the world is looking for a protection in times of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, government bonds and fiat currencies are a representation of the country and not necessarily a representation of value. And so I think that's largely what's been driving gold.
The world isn't rejecting the dollar specifically. It's rejecting the reliability of government-issued money across the board. Gold at 5,000 is the market saying it wants out of that system altogether. Now here's where the Iran conflict stops being a military story and becomes a monetary one. Weeks before any bombs dropped, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave a public speech describing exactly how the United States had already weaponized dollar liquidity against Iran.
Last month, the White House announced its maximum pressure campaign on Iran, designed to collapse its already buckling economy. The Iranian economy is in disarray. 35% official inflation, a currency that has depreciated 60% in the last 12 months, and an ongoing energy crisis. I know a few things about currency devaluations, and if I were an Iranian, I would get all of my money out of the rial now.
He laid out the playbook, and Brent Johnson connected those dots in real time.
I think they can use it as a geopolitical weapon against small and emerging countries and even some of the bigger countries, because once another country's currency starts to be rejected and instead using dollar stablecoins, because as bad as the dollar is, it's better than most other local currencies, that starts to strip away sovereignty from those local governments. One of the primary tools that any government has to control their population is the money. If they lose, and that's why the legal tenders laws exist. It's why they say gold can't be used as money. It's why there's rules around you can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin, because they need to be able to control those channels. If they start to lose control of those channels, they start to lose control of the economy. And if you look around the world and look through history, anytime anytime an economy has collapsed or a currency has collapsed, the government typically collapses shortly thereafter, which makes sense. If you lose your primary form of control, then you resort to your only remaining form of control, which is violence. And when that fails, you're gone. And governments can put down revolutions for a while, but if enough people revolt, they eventually fall. And when a country's currency fails, people feel like they have nothing left to lose. Let's revolt. Let's get rid of these jokers. Let's put some new guys in power. And that becomes very tenuous for the local government. I'm going to give you a perfect real world example right now. And that's Iran. And this is again, why you're asking me, why do I think they could weaponize it? Bessent just came out 2 weeks ago and said they weaponized the dollar against Iran. In a speech he gave, I can't remember where it was at. It might have been in Davos. He said, what we basically did was we caused dollar liquidity in Iran to dry up. That forced Iran to have to print a lot of money. When they printed a lot of money, their local currency fell in value. And when it fell in value, the people started to revolt because they couldn't do anything with the local currency. And it wasn't too long after that before they're out in the streets protesting. And here we are today. You combine all those things. And then 2 days ago, Bessent was in Dallas. And he gave a speech and he said, stable coins are a financial innovation that are very important and are going to be part of the system going forward. I know I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said. So when I see a guy who was part of the team that broke the Bank of England come out and say he knows how to weaponize a currency against a country, and then a few days later says stable coins are going to be a big part of the future, he's got my attention.
So the U.S. Treasury Secretary described on the record how they caused dollar liquidity in Iran to dry up. And that forced Iran to print. When they printed, the real collapsed. When the real collapsed, people took to the streets. And now here we are. Then days later, the same man stood up in Dallas and said that stablecoins are a financial innovation that will be a big part of the system going forward. This is sequencing. Currency warfare first, military strikes second, and programmable dollar rails positioned as the next instrument of projection. Think about what that means. The US doesn't necessarily need to invade a country to destabilize it. It just needs to dollarize it. Once a weaker nation citizens start using dollar stablecoins because their local currency is failing, that government loses its primary lever of control, the money. And when a government loses control of the money, as Brent laid out, it falls back on force. When force fails, the government fails. Now zoom out a little further. Iran sends roughly 85% of its crude oil to China. Venezuela previously sent over half of its exports there too. In the span of 2 months, the US moved on both, Venezuela first, then Iran. That's not a Middle East story dressed up as foreign policy. That's an energy war aimed at China without firing a single shot at Beijing. So while everyone is distracted by the missiles, the real move is happening on the energy chessboard. And right in the middle of all this, gold is suddenly getting rejected at its all-time high. Now, this doesn't mean that gold is broken, but it reveals the fact that gold still needs the system to work. It needs open markets, physical custody, counterparties you can trust, and ships that actually move through a strait. In other words, when the board gets flipped, gold gets stuck on it. What we're watching isn't one event, it's a compression. Matt Cole from the Hurdle Rate podcast frames why this pace isn't slowing down, and what it means that Bitcoin is holding up while the chaos accelerates.
What's going on in Iran with taking out the supreme leader there? And I think since the last hurdle rate, you also had the head of the cartel being taken out. It wasn't long ago that we took out the head of the Venezuelan government. And I just come back to a lot of the reasons why a lot of people invested in Bitcoin as digital freedom money and opt out from the system, a belief in the fourth turning playing out, a belief in the debasement trade. And I just think that we're seeing things move so quickly that it's really hard to even get a grasp of everything that's going on. You had Block buy Bitcoin, and they also laid off about 40% of their staff as well. And so Bitcoin holdings up, employees down. Fascinating. And I think that unpacking the totality of everything is simpler than zooming into any one thing, what's going to happen in Iran. But I tend to think, and this is something that may be less discussed, that it all actually, like all these regime change wars might actually tie back to AI itself. That if you think about all these dictators around the globe a fourth turning moment. And what does AI do? It gives power back to the individual. AI will also give power to all these dictatorships around the world. And so whether you agree with it or not, if you think about the United States, it seems like we are in attack mode, that we are going to take out perceived threats. And my belief is it's probably because we view these perceived threats to become bigger threats in the future. Just you put AI in the hands of anyone and it's going to be a force multiplier. It's going to be force multipliers for individuals, for creating one-person billion-dollar companies, to be able to lay off 40% of your staff. But that power, that increase of intelligence is going to circulate around the globe exponentially quick. And I think we're going to see chaos continue. And it may not be one-way chaos. We don't know. We can't predict that. But all of these things, this compression of time, and every week we're basically like covering a year's worth of topics, that's not going to slow down. And so things are not becoming scarce. That's going to go throughout the world. Bitcoin's the one thing that's scarce, that continues, I think, to benefit from all this global chaos. And I think it's interesting that amidst the global chaos, you saw Bitcoin actually is up right now.
That point about AI deserves a double click. If artificial intelligence becomes a force multiplier for authoritarian regimes, and it will, then the strategic incentives to act against those regimes now, before the technology compounds their power, changes the entire calculus. In other words, the fourth turning may just be accelerating on purpose. And amid all of this, one thing stays fixed. Bitcoin supply schedule, 21 million. No exceptions, no emergency issuance, no central bank printing more because the situation demands it. Everything else in the system can be expanded, diluted, confiscated, or frozen. Bitcoin can't. Matt's right. The totality is simpler than any one piece. What's scarce wins. Everything else is noise. Now, before we go further, there's a case against Bitcoin right now that deserves an honest hearing. Brent Johnson doesn't actually see Bitcoin as a crisis hedge. Not yet. Here's his reasoning.
Yeah, and this has been one of my arguments for a while, is people would tell me that Bitcoin was a flight to safety trade. And I have never seen Bitcoin perform well when there was some kind of a liquidity event or some kind of a crisis. To me, Bitcoin is a pure play on global liquidity. And as long as people are not worried and there's plenty of liquidity or plenty of money, Bitcoin is a fantastic way to speculate on whether liquidity is going to be plentiful or whether it's going to dry up. And as soon as it starts to dry up and as soon as there's some uncertainty, I think Bitcoin suffers the consequences of that, because I don't think that I don't see Bitcoin as pristine collateral. I know why. I completely understand the argument for why some people think it is. I've just never seen it perform that way. And I'm not saying it couldn't, but that's why I'm not surprised that it hasn't done as well over the last 6 months.
Now, it's important to point out that this Brent Johnson interview was recorded before the airstrikes against Iran. And he's right about the history. Bitcoin has not performed the way gold traditionally has during past crises. It's behaved more like a pure play on global liquidity than a flight to safety trade. When liquidity dries up and uncertainty spikes, Bitcoin has usually suffered. But this time things played out differently, with gold being hit as the conflict escalated and Bitcoin bouncing back and strengthening. Now, if you'd asked me a month ago how I would expect Bitcoin to react if total war broke out, I would have said that would lead us to a further breakdown in price. So is this proof that Bitcoin has arrived as pristine collateral? Not necessarily, but it's a data point that's worth taking seriously. If anything, Bitcoin's snap recovery after 5 months of bleeding tells you something. The sellers look to be mostly finished. What was left was the forced liquidation, and it got absorbed within hours. Both good signs. When the world is restructuring at this pace, the question stops being whether to own Bitcoin. It becomes whether your Bitcoin is truly yours. Swan Private works with families and individuals building serious long-term Bitcoin positions. You're not just using an app, you're working directly with dedicated Bitcoin experts who understand what you're building and why it matters. And for those who want full control, Swan Vault is collaborative self-custody. You hold 2 offline keys, and Swan manages a third for coordination, geographic distribution, and recovery. Full Bitcoin ownership with a setup designed to actually work. No lost keys, no single points of failure. Your Bitcoin, your keys, with a team that makes sure the process doesn't break. Learn more about Swan Private, Swan Vault, and all the other great services offered at Swan at swan.com/nosecondbest. Now, we've been talking a lot about geopolitics and macro and chessboards, but underneath all of the strategy, there are real people. People trying to feed their families, protect their savings, and figure out whether they can make it across a border with anything left. Ben Workman brings us back to what it actually means at the human level.
This war with Iran, It's just a reminder that you've got to be constantly preparing yourself for the fact that the world is going to change around you and you don't know when, you don't know how, you don't know why. So you get into this position where as an individual, as a company, as a nation, like you've got to be ready to pivot on a dime. And you've got to prepare yourself to be able to weather whatever changes it is that comes your way. We feel like we're doing that. We're building a business based on digital capital with no issuer that's not tied to any one nation anywhere in the world. And I think that's becoming critically important. Think if you're an Iranian citizen. I don't know if you saw some of the charts around the Iranian currency, but it basically flash crashed the minute this happened, right? So you're seeing how unstable it is for a country to have its own currency. That currency is really only good as long as there's a country. And then the question arises, who's in charge of that country? And is that country stable? Is this currency good for anything at this point? And you start to realize that as this happens more and more around the world, everybody needs to prepare themselves for the potential outcome that this could happen in your backyard. And it's a reminder that we talk about Bitcoin a lot in the context of the US and of the US markets and within the US banking system, within the US financial system, but Bitcoin's for everybody. And I think that these are the moments that truly highlight that. And if I was in one of these regions, I wouldn't be able to get out filling a truck bed full of gold and trying to drive across the border. I don't think that would go very well. You'd be able to take Bitcoin with you, and at least you're able to take that value with you anywhere you go in the world. So I think it's an important reminder of what it is that makes Bitcoin so incredibly unique relative to any other asset in the world.
This is what every monetary crisis in history looks like for people living through it. You can't carry gold through a checkpoint. You can't wire money from a collapsed banking system. But 12 words in your head can carry a lifetime of value across any border on Earth. Right now, real people are watching their savings evaporate in real time. But Iranians who held Bitcoin were able to retain their wealth. Real estate, stocks, fiat, none of it survives currency collapse. Bitcoin doesn't take up physical space. It moves without detection. Governments have zero control over it. It can't be debased. It can't be taken from you without your permission. That's real utility. The kind of utility that doesn't need a bull market to matter. So if the last few weeks have reminded you why signal matters more than noise, there's one conference I want to put on your radar. BitBlock Boom. April 8th through 12th in Fort Worth, Texas, it's the world's longest running Bitcoin-only conference, now in its 9th year. This is not a crypto circus. It's focused, it's serious, and it's built for people who want to have real conversations about real money. Corey and Brady from Swan will be there, as well as the Swan Private team. So visit bitblockboom.com for tickets and use discount code SWAN at checkout. Okay, let's bring this home. The conflict in the Middle East is accelerating. Gold has corrected. Bitcoin held. That sequence alone deserves your attention. But the real story isn't one weekend of price action. It's the architecture underneath. Scott Bessent described the currency warfare playbook before the first missiles launched. Stablecoins are being positioned as programmable dollar weapons that can strip sovereignty from any nation that can't defend its own currency. Energy flows are being rerouted to squeeze China's growth engine without firing a single shot at Beijing. The monetary order isn't collapsing on its own. It's being dismantled, deliberately, by the people who built it. And gold, the 5,000-year-old safe haven, just showed you its limits. Because gold still depends on the system. It needs open markets. It needs custody. It needs trust. Bitcoin doesn't need any of that. No functioning state, no trusted counterparty, no one's permission to move, to settle, or to cross a border. A fixed supply that can't be printed, confiscated, or frozen. So reminder, this is not a trade, and it's not a speculation. It's the exit from the chessboard itself. So whether you're in Fort Worth or Tehran, the math is the same. 21 million, no exceptions, and a network that doesn't care who's bombing who. So 2 questions I want you to think about. First, did Bitcoin's price action this weekend change how you think about its role during geopolitical crisis? Or do you still see it as a pure liquidity play? Second, if you were an Iranian citizen right now, what asset would you want to be holding? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if this episode made you think, hit that like button. Share it with someone who's watching the headlines and wondering what it means for their money. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Swan Bitcoin channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the game of money, there is no second best.